Okay, so welcome again. My name is Ann O'Brien. I'm the Director of Community Engagement here at IRIS, and we appreciate you all joining us for this community update and regarding what's going on with the worldwide refugee crisis, as well as how that is going to be impacting not just IRIS, but all of our families in Connecticut. So we wanted to go ahead and get started. If you're joining us a little late, welcome again, and go ahead and put your selves on mute and then add questions as we go to the chat. We'll take questions at the end. So I'm the Director of Community Engagement and Co-Sponsorship here at IRIS. I want to introduce our speakers this morning. Alia Seraj, who is a new IRIS board member, but is definitely not new to the experiences of refugees. She is the daughter of Afghan refugees who resettled in Connecticut many years ago. We also have Chris George, our executive director, who will go over an update in more detail as far as how things are looking at IRIS in the short term and in the long term. And then we'll have a Q&A at the end. So with that, I wanted to go ahead and turn things over to Alia. Alia, welcome.
Hi, thank you so much for having me, and thank you to everybody for taking this time out of your Friday for this very important update and for engaging with IRIS on something that is so intensely close to my heart and obviously impacting the global environment at such great scale. We just really appreciate your time and participation. And I am so honored to speak to this gorgeous picture of these Afghan children enjoying ice cream in shorts on a February day, much like my 13-year-old nephew does still when it's freezing out here in Connecticut on most days. But this is the Adila family, and they arrived in January. They were welcomed to Willimantic by the Quiet Corner co-sponsored group. So thank you so much to that co-sponsor group for doing such incredible work. And, you know, I see their faces and there is just so much familiarity to me in many ways. One, just in the joy and excitement over ice cream as children who are here in our community, but also in the very obviously Afghan faces that I see. And a very brief reason why I am so involved now with IRIS and so honored to be a part of it is, you know, I have an American mother and an Afghan father. My family left Afghanistan in 1978 when the communists came in and there was a coup, and my father was forced to flee the country. My American mother had been living there at the time with him for a couple of years with my two older sisters, who were at the time younger than the children in this photo. And in the night, they had to flee through many checkpoints of military, intimidation into Pakistan. And when I see this photo, I'm reminded of the story of my dad, who told me that when they finally made it to Pakistan, they sat for breakfast and had eggs. And he said that nothing had ever tasted so much like freedom than those eggs. And I have to imagine that when I see these kids with ice cream with not the threat of violence or retaliation against their families or an imminent danger around them in our Connecticut community, that somewhere inside they feel the same. And it just touches me deeply, and I'm just so happy to see them and welcome them to our community. I wanted to take a minute just to level set what's really happening in the world beyond the current crisis that feels like there's a new news story every day, and to really bring everybody's attention to the magnitude that is the refugee crisis in the current world state. You know, less than a year ago in July, we were already at the worst refugee crisis since World War II. The 29 million refugees worldwide, that number is not now, that number is 9 months ago, when there were already so many displaced people in countries from around the world for a myriad of reasons. And at that point in time, you know, there was a plan by the Biden-Harris administration to increase the US welcoming of refugees. And so for a time, it had been sort of slowed to a trickle under prior administrations, and the Biden-Harris administration had planned to welcome 125,000 refugees as of October of 2021. And this was prior to either of the major refugee crises that we've now experienced in the last 6 to 7, 8 months at this point. So a month after that July number, Afghanistan fell to the Taliban. 6 months after that, Russia invaded Ukraine. And in the matter of just a few more months, that biggest ever refugee number exploded by 25% to now 35 million refugees worldwide. So I just want everyone to think about that number, because when we talk about the thousands, the tens of thousands, the hundreds of thousands that the US is looking to resettle, it is just a fraction of what's happening at a global scale. And if we want to just dive in a little bit deeper to what's going on and what has happened in the two most immediate and most known crises from a refugee standpoint. In August of 2021, the Taliban reclaimed control of Afghanistan and immediately sought to close down its borders and prohibit everyone from leaving the country. And since that time, 2.2 million refugees have fled. And unlike other situations where refugees seek humanitarian passages out of their country over time, the majority of this happened in a very cacophonous, just sort of absurd fashion, all at once into the world stage, trying to find a new place to call home. Half of those refugees are being hosted in neighboring countries, especially in Pakistan. And they, due to the just sort of mass exodus, they were placed in bases all around the world for processing. In order to streamline that, there have been 2 processing centers set up now in Doha, and as well as in Pakistan. And so having these processing centers means rather than having all of the Afghans who are set to come to the US come in and attempt the asylum passage through multiple ports within the US, there is now an expedited process in these key locations where by the time that refugees pass through these processing centers and arrive within the US, they will have already gone through all of the necessary steps to arrive with refugee status. And Chris can certainly correct me if I have any of that incorrect. He is far more close to the processing of refugees than I am, but from a scale perspective, that is a massive exodus of a population. And unlike other refugees, Afghans don't have the option of waiting to go home. In fact, more Afghans, more than we can count, are still in the country, unable to get out and seek this status because those borders are now closed. And as the Taliban continue to put pressures on women and take back promises of their ability to sort of modernize and fight for the people, I imagine that there will continue to be more and more who seek to get out through other means. I think, fast forward a couple of months now as we look to Ukraine, just in March of 2022, staggering number of Ukrainians have left the country. We are talking about 1 out of every 4 Ukrainians is now a refugee. 3.9 million Ukrainian refugees have fled. 2 million of those are in Poland. Poland has been quite welcoming to their neighboring Ukrainian refugees. I think the different situation here, and probably the story of many refugees around the world, is that I do believe that Ukrainians are looking toward the day where they can go home again, where the conflict will come to an end and there will be a home to return to. But in the meantime, there are certainly millions of displaced Ukrainians who are in need of, if not permanent, then temporary resettlement. And Chris will talk more about the current status of what's happening with the US plan for those. But that is the current scale. It is not certainly the entire representation of refugees around the world, but it does just bring, a bit of a pause to perhaps the most significant refugee populations that the world is currently working to process today.
Great, thank you, Alia. And now we'll switch to Chris George, our Executive Director, to give a little bit more of an in-depth look in terms of how all of these really staggering numbers and changes in the world have impacted the refugee resettlement process worldwide, as well as the US plans at a national level and all the way down to Iris. So Chris.
Thanks. And it's good to see all you people on this Friday morning, a lot of familiar faces. As the pandemic wanes, I've been getting out to do a little more speaking than I have over the past couple of years. In fact, I've had at least one engagement every week. And if you've heard me talk, I often begin with the total number of refugees in the world. Well, 5 weeks ago, at a talk at a Catholic church in West Hartford, I said there were 30 million refugees in the world. The next week, at the Guilford Rotary Club, I had to say there were 31 million refugees in the world. The following week, I had to say there were 32 million, 33 million, 34 million. This week, at the Monroe Rotary Club, I had to sadly acknowledge there are 35 million refugees in the world. They really are staggering numbers. Just compare it for a moment with the population of the state of Connecticut. So who knows the population of the state of Connecticut? Steve Hudspeth, you must know. Yes, 3.3 million, right. 3.3 million people in the state of Connecticut. There are 10 times as many refugees in the world today. So the US Refugee Resettlement Program, you all know, if you've been in touch with us, we were asked to do what most considered the impossible. We were asked to, when I say we, the refugee resettlement organizations in this country, there are 9 national groups, 200 nonprofits spread across the country. We were asked to resettle 76,000 Afghan evacuees. Technically, they were humanitarian parolees, but basically refugees. We were asked to resettle 76,000 over the space of just 3, maybe 4 months. That's a number that we have a hard time resettling in a year as a network of refugee agencies. IRIS rarely resettles more than 300 a year. When it was all over and the numbers were counted, we had resettled more than 400 Afghan evacuees in the space of just 3 months. And we're still recovering from that. The refugee resettlement agencies were asked to do this almost impossible task at probably the worst time possible over the past 10 years. During the Trump administration, they had to lay off staff. Some closed down. In fact, here in Connecticut, one of 3 refugee resettlement agencies, Catholic Charities based in Hartford, had to shut down completely during the Trump administration. So we had to get ready quickly. And with your help, and I'm not just saying that, with your help, we were able to do it. In fact, 1/3 of the Afghans that we resettled, that we welcomed and resettled in Connecticut, 1/3 of them were placed with community groups. Imagine if every refugee agency, if all 200 of those nonprofit refugee resettlement agencies spread across the country, imagine if each of them had as strong, robust a community co-sponsorship program. We would have been able to resettle many more Afghans more easily, and maybe even over a shorter period of time. Well, they're all off the military bases now. And the Department of Defense is happy about that. By the way, they did a real bang up job of really kind of rolling out the red carpet, so to speak, and providing good facilities for the Afghans while they waited on the military bases. But they're all off the bases. We're in phase 2 now of welcoming Afghans. And what is significant about the past 6 months is the State Department has allowed groups to initiate, in effect, experiment with private co-sponsorship, or we call it community-based resettlement. In Connecticut, we call it community co-sponsorship. But the State Department has allowed organizations that have been promoting this community-based resettlement, they've allowed us to experiment and implement programs across the country. One of them is called Sponsor Circles. I don't know if you can see that name above my shoulder. And based partly on the success that we've had in Connecticut, and also borrowing from the Canadian model, a Sponsor Circle program has been initiated, and to our delight, more and more refugee resettlement agencies are doing community co-sponsorship. So swinging open our doors and allowing the public to come in and participate in this great American tradition of welcoming refugees. Too long, it has been implemented in the shadows or under the radar, just with the professional staff of nonprofit groups doing most of the work. We need to get more people from the public involved, because that builds public support, and that can also lead to political support. And honestly, we've all learned over the past few years that political support for refugee resettlement is probably more important than financial support. All right, moving along. You can take a look at those numbers. That red bar that you saw on the previous slide, that's the number of humanitarian parolees. So how do things stand now? Is that the right slide? Is that the right one? Nationalities being resettled? Good. So the State Department has promised us that it will return to the traditional refugee resettlement program with a wide variety of refugees coming into the United States in high numbers. That was postponed a bit. It was delayed because of the Afghan crisis. But they've told us it is not going to be pushed back or delayed because of the crisis in Ukraine. Ukrainians will be coming to the United States, as many as 100,000, but they will be spread over a much longer period of time than the Afghans were. And at the same time, we've been told by the State Department, we will be able to return to a more balanced refugee resettlement program with people coming from different places. Afghanistan, Congo, Syria, we've already started welcoming Syrian refugee families again. Sudanese, even El Salvador, Eritrea. We welcomed a case from Honduras recently. So a return to the more balanced refugee resettlement program, and at the same time, yes, we can do both. At the same time, we will also be welcoming Ukrainians, probably through a variety of different pathways, not all through the refugee resettlement program. The next slide. Is the next slide up? And I'm just, there it is. We've also been told that family reunification will be a major factor with the resettlement. So relatives of evacuees who are still in Afghanistan, we will try to get them out one way or another and resettle them in the United States. You all know the basic policy of refugee resettlement is the State Department will ask a refugee family, once they have been cleared and vetted, do you have a relative in the United States? And in most cases, the State Department will try to satisfy that request and send the family to that relative. Why did almost 500 Afghans come to IRIS in Connecticut? Because they had what we call a US tie, in most cases a relative or a close friend. And So that'll be the basis for going forward. The same with Ukraine. In fact, I think even President Biden mentioned when he said we would be welcoming 100,000 Ukrainians, they will almost all be Ukrainian refugees who have family ties in the United States. And if they have family ties in Connecticut, then we would expect them to come to Connecticut. If it is in our geographical area, then we would expect to be involved in welcoming them. And we could use all the help we can get. So if community groups want to form and get training, we would love to place families with you. We can't promise they'll be Ukrainian. Might be a Syrian family, might be a family from Afghanistan, but our experience has been it really doesn't make any difference to not to us and to co-sponsorship groups. So the big change from the past administration to the current, of course, is the Muslim travel ban has been lifted from 8 mainly Muslim countries. So those refugee resettlement programs are starting up again, most notably Syria. And many of the Syrian refugees coming to Connecticut now and in the future will be related to the Syrians who are already here, who were resettled mostly in 2016 and 2017. Travel ban also lifted for Sudan, fortunately still producing refugees. And we want to start up the Central American Minors Program. That's a program that allows legal parents in the United States to request their children under 21 to come to the United States and join them. So we're hoping that program starts up again. That reminds me, when I see Central America, you all probably know that one of the major changes that IRIS has undergone over the past 5 years, partly in response to the previous administration, but mostly because we wanted to address the needs of immigrants in Connecticut, we have dramatically expanded our services for undocumented immigrants. And that program has grown from very small, almost kind of incidental assistance to a full-fledged program with 4 case managers, 2 attorneys, and that will continue on to the future. In a way, we are fulfilling that promise that you see in our name, Integrated Refugee and Immigrant Services. Yes, we're primarily a refugee resettlement agency, but recently we have dramatically expanded our services for our undocumented neighbors, most of them from Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. Anything else? Is there another slide? Hey, I think we're ready for Q&A. That's great. Good. And I think you're going to see what kind of questions we have.
Well, yes, we are. So as I mentioned at the beginning, feel free to go ahead and put your questions into the chat, and then we will work our way through them as we go. We do have a lot of folks on the call now, so I'm going to try to take the questions through the chat instead of everybody unmuting. So Vivian, I see you have your hand raised. If you wouldn't mind, go ahead and put your question in the chat. We've got 111 people on this call. It's a great turnout. So one of the questions that we had was what this is really going to look like in terms of the, and this was somebody put a question through me privately, what will this really look like in terms of the worldwide changes and the ability of community groups to resettle? What countries will the families be from that you would place with community groups? So Chris, you want to take that one?
Yeah, well, it depends less on the nationality and more on their U.S. tie, their relative. If the relative and the family itself are just insisting, and we say it's a free country and we do give people a say and how they're resettled. If the relative living here and the new family that's arrived are really insisting on staying in, let's say New Haven or in Hartford, and we don't have any community groups in those immediate areas, then they will likely be resettled by our staff, and that'll be fine. I mean, our staff are probably some of the best refugee resettlement professionals in the country, and they do a great job. But if a family does not have a U.S. tie and could be placed really anywhere, and we think they would do well, anywhere, then they would be candidates for community co-sponsorship, definitely. So it depends less on the nationality. Of course, we also don't pay any attention to religion. We will look to see if the community group has as its resources languages that the new arrival speaks. But those are the factors that we look at. And I know there may be a group with a lot of members who are really super sympathetic about what's going on in Ukraine, and you would love to host a family from Ukraine. And there may be families coming from Ukraine, but if we felt that we needed a group to instead welcome a family from Syria or Sudan or Congo or Afghanistan, that would be our preference, and we're hoping groups are flexible.
Yeah, so that's a great point, Chris. Another question that had come in is, our group is ready and has been waiting. How long do you think it will be until a family is placed with us? So that's a closely related question. So basically for the groups, the community groups that have gone through the training, have gotten organized, done all their fundraising, and have given us, met all the criteria to be greenlit is what we refer to it. One of the things that impacts how long you might wait is whether or not you have multiple languages, that you have enough interpreters in so that you can welcome a family either from Syria or the Congo, or from Afghanistan or Ukraine. It will be many months likely before we have Ukrainian refugees coming through the federal resettlement program. As Alia mentioned at the beginning, the vast majority of those refugees, just like any refugee from any country, prefers to wait to see if they can go back home. So even though 4 million have fled Ukraine, so many of those, the largest majority of those, will want to wait as long as possible, a year or more in a neighboring country, before they make the decision that they simply can't go back home. And that is when they start the process overseas to possibly go into the resettlement program that goes worldwide. So it will be a while before we're seeing refugees from the Ukraine coming through our resettlement program. But in the meantime, if you're a community group, we had a number of our community groups pivot just a month ago and hustle to find enough interpreters so that now 4 of our community groups that are greenlit in 3 different languages, in Pashto Dari, as well as Swahili, as well as also being greenlit in Arabic. So that's the way to really be able to help with this worldwide crisis that has grown exponentially. Another question, and maybe Chris, you'd want to take this one, is what are sponsor circles?
Great question. So Sponsor Circles is a brand new program. It was developed by a number of people from Canada and the United States, including input from IRIS, a program that would operate outside of the US government refugee resettlement program, but with the US government's blessing. And it requires a minimum of 5 people to come together in a circle, get some training, not unlike the training that community co-sponsorships groups in Connecticut get, a little abbreviated. And once they've been trained, once they've submitted an application, and they used our application as a model for their application, once they've submitted an application, they could receive an Afghan family. It was a program that was developed to address the emergency situation of having more Afghans on military bases, then the refugee resettlement agencies could resettle. So it was a crisis. It was an emergency. And this little program got off to a good start. It has resettled about 400 people spread across the United States. Anne and I and Cindy Dunn and Barb Davis were involved in training these groups and then supporting them after they've received the family. It could be the prototype, the precursor to a private sponsorship program in the United States, similar to Canadian private sponsorship. So thank you, Connecticut, for really making that possible. I mean, sounds like I'm bragging, but I'm also attributing a lot of this success to you all. If it had not been for the successful co-sponsorship program in Connecticut that showed the rest of the country that it can be done, we might not have this sponsor circle program.
Great. So another question that I thought was really interesting that somebody had posed is how do we prioritize amongst our legal team the various needs of all of our clients? Obviously, from the fall, with so many of the arrivals from the Afghan evacuation now needing asylum assistance, as well as the large caseload that we took on during the pandemic and the years before. There's also folks that we serve from the undocumented. And, one part of the answer to that, and I'll let Chris add on to it, is driven by our funding, right? So initially, the way in which we were able to expand our asylum seeking support, no matter what country they were from, is through grants, right? And when we get those grants to be able to hire additional lawyers, and they specify that they're to work with asylum seekers, that drives, a certain amount of prioritization, but those could be really from any country. We did get a specialized grant at the beginning that allowed us to specifically hire a lawyer or two that worked exclusively on defense of those that were at risk of imminent deportation. So again, not country exclusive. So, but we also have other lawyers that are working exclusively with clients that are our refugee population. So the other thing that I would say that we have been doing that has been really expansive for us is training volunteers, lawyers that by day do other legal work and wanted to help out during this crisis that's been going on 6 months. And we've actually been training lawyers to be able to do pro bono work with us in terms of filing for humanitarian parole applications, as well as a number of different parts of the work. So there's many aspects to how we prioritize the work for our legal team. Chris, you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think you've covered it. We're part of a coalition in Connecticut that is working toward getting public funding for universal representation. What we mean by that is we would like for immigration courts to use that same principle that Americans are so proud of in criminal court, which is everyone will have representation. We all know that no matter how horrible the crime is, the person accused of it needs to be treated fairly in a court, and we will even provide them with a government financed public defender. That principle does not exist in immigration courts. First time I went to an immigration court in Hartford, an immigrant was facing the judge without a lawyer, and I leaned over and said to somebody, "Where's the attorney?" And they laughed and they said, "Not an immigration court. You're not guaranteed one." So we are part of a coalition where we believe that policy should be applied to immigration court. We have our attorneys who are representing people who are in deportation proceedings so that they have that chance to be treated fairly. So that's high priority. We hope we do not have to prioritize all of those who are here now on humanitarian parole status and need to apply for asylum. We hope we will be able to arrange one way or another representation so that they can apply for asylum. We won't have to say, sorry, we can't help you to anyone. It's going to take some time. As Ann said, we're going to implement a pro bono program and attract as many attorneys as possible, give them some training and give them a case and provide some oversight. But we hope that we'll be able to help all of them one way or another.
Great, thank you, Chris. So this next question, I'm going to ask Alia to address. When do you expect to complete the resettlement of Afghan refugees?
I wish there was a completion date. I think the reality is, refugees can wait for quite some time to go through the process. While everybody was evacuated as quickly as humanly possible, they will not be resettled on any specific timeline. So, I expect it to be years and years before the trickle stops. Unfortunately, there is no clear answer to that.
That's exactly right. As you notice, we still have many folks coming from the Congo. That conflict has been going on for decades upon decades. And honestly, now Afghanistan is in the same situation. So their government is not readily letting people leave the country. When they are able to get out, it's going to take them many years to get through the process of either integrating in the neighboring country or making their way through the process to be resettled through one of the UN member countries and coming here. So it's going to be going on for a long time. We still are working through, as Alia touched upon in the earlier part of the presentation, just the initial resettlement of those that were evacuated back in August. So yes, those that were brought here, the 70,000 that were brought here immediately to the US have all been resettled into communities, but there were another 30,000 that were sent to US military bases around the world. And as Alia touched upon earlier, those folks are being processed through new processing centers that were set up in Doha and hopefully brought to the country as refugees so that we don't have more of a crush on the immigration system in bringing them in as humanitarian parolees. But they have slowed down that process in order to make sure that everybody has their entry documents in place. That was another enormous challenge with what happened in the fall, is we brought a lot of people here really rapidly, but we didn't provide them immediate refugee status. And so it was a long wait for a lot of them to be able to just work, to have work authorization and social security cards. We actually have people from the fall that are still waiting for those. So it's important that folks go through the refugee process status so that when they get here, they can start working immediately. Just to move on in terms of some of the questions, let's see, are there Afghans who are in this country who are waiting for placement? Where are they and when will they be resettled? So yes, there are folks that have, for instance, done what a lot of folks naturally thought would be doable. They've gone to one community, but they originally wanted to be in Sacramento or Houston. So then they have become secondary migrants to those communities. But then they have found out that there's no housing in those communities. And so we're starting to see in our community in New Haven, as well as others around the country, folks that are showing up as third, tertiary migrants from amongst the Afghan families that are showing up in our cities and saying, is there any way I can find housing here? So we have actually moved, I think at last count, 3 or 4 of those walk-in cases is how we refer to them, because they weren't brought here directly from a military base. They actually got to our community independently, and we placed those with co-sponsor groups as well, because housing is so tight in New Haven. So we are working through it all, and just like every other resettlement agency around the country. So I want to make sure that we get to some of these other questions. When a group sponsors a refugee, are there funds which are available for rent, etc.? Or is the group or circle putting the refugees up in their homes? So that's a complicated question. Chris, you want to take a run at the first part of that, as far as whether or not there are funds available?
Sure. So for years, ever since the current refugee resettlement program and structure was established in the early 80s, the State Department has always provided a little bit of funding as a one-time Welcome to America grant. So there's money from the State Department. The amount has gone up over the years. It's now $2,275 per refugee, goes to the Refugee Resettlement Agency, and that's basically divided into two parts. The Refugee Agency keeps half of it to cover their costs, hiring case managers, and job developers, education coordinators, whatever. And then the other half, 1,100 and something, will go to the refugee. So if it's a family of 5, that's going to be more than $5,000 that the refugee family receives as a one-time Welcome to America. Most of that goes toward their rent. We will provide that money to a community co-sponsorship group, same way we provide it to a family that's being resettled by our staff. So yes, community group will receive that initial chunk of money for the refugee, and they'll almost always put it toward rent. But they will have to raise money, community group, raise private funds themselves to bridge that gap between the end of the federal money and the beginning of when that family can be self-sufficient. And so it's a combination. Their funding is a combination, what they raise and what comes from the government. Now, sponsor circles, remember I said it operates outside the US government program. Sponsor circles have to raise all of the $2,275 themselves, and again, per person, and spend that on the family that they are welcoming. We want to send the message to the Afghans who are thinking, oh, do I want to go with the sponsor circle? Do I want to just go to a refugee resettlement agency? We want them to know that the financial assistance is exactly the same.
Great. So there was a really simple question that was put in the chat. Do the current refugees have to pay back their airfares? So if they come through the typical federal refugee resettlement program, then yes, they do. It's a unique attribute of the US resettlement program that we actually make refugees, no matter how long they've been sitting in a camp or whatever the situation was, they actually have to pay for their own plane ticket to get here. The vast majority, if they've been waiting in a camp for a decade or more, do not have those funds. And so they actually have to take out a loan in order to be able to have the opportunity to be resettled in the US. Some of them are able to pay for it if they have some means of income, but most have a loan that they've had to take out and have to pay back once they get here. I will tell you, the folks that were evacuated from Afghanistan that everybody saw the pictures of on TV last August did not have to pay for that flight, but it wasn't exactly as if they had a nice plush seat either. So those were military crafts, and there was aircraft, and there was no loan to be paid back for that ticket. There were no tickets. Everybody just was able to get on. So those folks do not have a loan that has to be paid back, but the formal, normal refugee resettlement process does, that they have a ticket that they have to pay back. So there's also another question, can the community sponsor groups repay the loan for airfare? That is a complicated question that we address as part of the training and then afterward. It's really important that the refugees have a sense for that loan and their payments for it. It helps to build their credit in the US. It's one of the benefits of having that loan. It's also something that if for some reason they separate from the community group or they move to another state, they need to be able to track that themselves very independently. So it's not always a benefit to try to pay that off, but that's a longer conversation, but it's a good question, Sue. Just looking back through here, Zini or Kelly, feel free to jump in if there's one that I have missed that would be good for others to direct. Again, everybody asked whether or not there are Afghans who are still waiting for placement. And yes, there are. Our community groups have actually accommodated migrants coming from other parts of the country who were related to the family they originally resettled. So community groups have reached out to us and said, remember the original family? Well, I've got 2 more now. So we've been excited to see that happen. Somebody had also asked whether or not we have a projection of how many Afghan families we at IRIS will be resettling in the next 3 to 6 months. Well, we're happy to tell you that we welcomed 8 families, 8 Afghan families just this week that all went out to community groups. So that was a fun couple of days this past week. And then we got a notice just 2 days ago of another small family that was coming tonight. So we're still in some situations on a 48 hours notice or less. Those families all had US ties that we were resettling them near. So it's impossible for us to project at this point exactly what our allocation will be by country. What we do know is that we are positioned based upon the numbers that we provided our national organization to have likely the largest year we have ever had. We expect by the end of this federal fiscal year, which ends September 30th, to have welcomed close to 600 between all the various programs. And that still leaves another quarter in the calendar year. So it's going to be a large number, but already we're seeing a real diverse mix, not just from Afghanistan. We're already seeing a lot of folks in our pipeline. We just don't have travel dates yet, but folks from the Congo, some folks from El Salvador, as well as Chris mentioned from Syria, some non-US tie. So people that don't actually have family members coming that are originally refugees from Syria, which really warms our hearts, right? Because those folks were kept out for so long. So just looking at more questions in the chat. Let's see, can you explain why some refugees are processed as humanitarian parolees? Is this just a matter of urgency, lack of time to process them as refugees? Chris, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I mean, you guessed it. The humanitarian parole program is used to quickly remove someone who's in imminent danger to a safe place and complete the immigration process later. So parolees were whisked away, or Afghans were whisked out of Afghanistan because they were in danger. You'll remember those horrible scenes at the Kabul airport, brought to the United States and given 2 years to change their status from temporary to permanent. In most cases, that's going to mean applying for asylum or applying for special immigrant visa. They were all vetted. They all went through a security vetting process. I don't think for a minute that they were not checked to make sure they're coming to the United States for the right reasons. Most of these people had already been working for the US government, so they had been vetted once already. And then they went through another screening process before coming to the United States. And some people do get screened out. I have heard of cases that, something turned up in the interview or the database checks, phone number matched a phone number of someone who did something horrible, and the person, had to wait, wasn't allowed in. So vetting process still goes on, but you're exactly right. The humanitarian parole process is used to quickly remove someone who's in danger.
Great. So there is a question in the chat, and then a couple of private chats to me asking whether or not there is special additional governmental assistance available to either Ukrainian refugees or to the Afghan refugees. So that's a really good question, and it's super complicated. If everybody can remember back to last August when the evacuations began, again, there were 70,000, which is almost equivalent to a year's worth of what the US would normally welcome in terms of refugees. 70,000 evacuated from Afghanistan and immediately brought to the US, and they had to be placed in communities. Well, what was also going on and is still going on is a post-pandemic, nearly inexplicable housing crisis. There's many reasons that explain it, but nothing explains some of the elements of it. But there is a lack of availability, particularly of affordable apartments. And those are the ones that these refugees need. They're making, they're starting from absolute scratch, and we need the most affordable apartments possible. When the state of Connecticut, as well as the federal government, saw that that was the reality, eventually some funds were made available. We were really, really excited that the state of Connecticut by November was able to identify some funds that were made available to alleviate part of this strain. They also provided us as the resettlement agencies flexibility in terms of how we use those funds, which was enormously helpful. So it was to be used to help with rent and security deposits. Probably all of you are safely in your homes that are mortgage paid for or otherwise. If you were trying to rent an apartment right now, you would discover that you are expected to put down not just 1 month security deposit, but oftentimes 2 and 3 months. This is a post-pandemic nuance. So we have been able to use those funds from the state to be able to help some of those Afghan families. Also, many of them, their entry documents were still waiting on them. Some of them still don't have Social Security cards, and they were supposed to have those 5 months ago. So for those folks, they've needed additional help. So we've been able to make the funds stretch. Ukrainians are not yet coming through the federal resettlement program, so there have not been any special funds made available. What we are also trying to do is to fundraise for housing support, because our other refugee population, as we mentioned, that are still coming from the Congo and still coming from Sudan and Syria, they are entering that same housing crisis, and we are entering it alongside with them. So they're making basic entry-level wages. Wages have not gone up, but rents have gone up 20 and 25% compared to pre-pandemic times. So there are some funds being made available, but we know it's not going to cover close to the needs for all of our populations.
And I'm going to quickly mention an initiative that we began this year. I've been thinking about it for 17 years. We finally did it this year. We have introduced an idea, a concept for a bill before the General Assembly here in Connecticut. So the state of Connecticut, from its state budget, we're asking it to allocate $1,000 per refugee as a welcome to Connecticut supplement to the federal funding. We know that rents are higher here than in other states. That federal allocation is the same across the country, no matter whether it is Kentucky or Maine or Connecticut. So we're asking the Connecticut state legislature to pass a law that says every refugee coming to Connecticut will get a little extra help, because we don't want our state to be too expensive for refugees. We want Connecticut to be a welcoming state and to do its share in resettling the world's persecuted people. So I hope it goes before the General Assembly this session. We might be sending out something to all of you saying, call or email your local representative to make this happen.
Great. Yeah, that's one of the incredible benefits that has come from the awful crisis this past fall, is that We had literally weekly conversations happening with all of the affected state level agencies, pulled together through a task force from the governor's office. We're so grateful to that happening. And even though things have slowed down a little bit in terms of the crisis in resettling that huge push of Afghan refugees, the governor's task force has agreed to continue meeting on a monthly basis because that they see what is happening worldwide as well as nationwide. So we're hopeful that there'll be even more involvement going forward. Somebody had asked about the fact that there was a continuing resolution that provided funds for things such as English language classes and otherwise. And somebody else, our very knowledgeable community, I love it, answered it accurately already, and that there are, that those funds went to make more ESL classes available, right? So to expand the offerings across communities. So I think that has been happening in a number of different communities around the nation, recognizing that the key for a lot of these folks to be able to actually get to the point of a living wage is for them to be able to increase their English skills, but the access to classes needed to increase as well. So at that, we are out of time for today. I just wanted to thank again Alia for making her time available, also for her joining our board at this time. It's really incredible and incredibly important for us to have folks that have that lived experience, particularly generational, represented on our board. So really appreciate you being here. And to so many people, over 100 showing up for this call. I know we haven't answered all your questions, and we're sorry that we're not as available as we like to be. We literally are still digging out from the fall and won't bore you with those details, but I promise for all of those that had specific community co-sponsor group questions, we'll hold a different call and I will answer all of those questions in a different session that are specific to the community groups that are waiting or hoping to get going, Mr. Hudspeth in Wilton. So we really appreciate everybody being here this morning. Chris, Alia, any parting words?
You know, again, you all have put Connecticut on the global map, not just the national map for refugee resettlement, but the global map, because we're also connected to a global refugee sponsorship initiative where we're trying to promote community-based resettlement around the world. And we are always referring to the great experience that you all have really made possible here in Connecticut. So you're doing a great job. Thank you very, very much. And yes, as Ann said, you know, we'll be available to answer other questions. We'll try to do these a little more often. And again, thanks a lot.
Likewise, I echo it. Thank you so much for all that you do. I am, you know, lucky to have grown up with an Afghan family around me, both here and still in Afghanistan. I know firsthand what it means to have community support, and you guys are doing amazing things. You will affect generations of Americans who will have started through this process because of you.